So this is Karen and I are going to do this kind of tour debrief of a whole bunch of issues that we work with, often around learning communities, technology, liberating structures, and faith-based or small communities that uh, are together over long periods of time, and so have deep roots, and at the same time may struggle with new opportunities, new challenges. So we've been meeting about every month for years as a kind of learning nourishment kind of practice. So I did an event this morning where which I'm going to debrief and explain it to someone that I respect a lot. So that would be different from explaining it to someone that doesn't have a background. So that's kind of like, setting the frame here for what kind of conversation this is. So actually, I made some notes in advance of what to do beforehand to prepare. And so I'm going to share my notes first. And they were in Evernote. And so I'm going to share that screen for a second. And so there's this. So preparing to lead is, the first thing is to close everything that you're not using. I tend to have like a dozen or more windows open, like a text editor, a command line thing to do stuff in Unix, this and that kind of just leftover stuff that I'm using, haven't closed, I might need them again. So for this purpose, close them all down so that when you're going to share your screen, you have a very limited set of things to choose from. Because in the past, I've found that I go to share my screen, and then I have to scroll down through all these other window alternatives because I want to share just one screen. So the things that I kept open this morning were Zoom, a browser, and the text editor. The text editor had some questions that I was going to ask people. And I'll show you those in a minute. The tabs in the browser were the Google Slides that I was going to walk through, a spreadsheet to convert the chat, and the chat destination, that is where I'm going to end up. And more about that in a minute. So let's see if that, so yeah, I still do have the text. Here's the text that I had handy in behind the scenes. So the approach that I use is to have these questions kind of queued up to throw in the chat. And so that's basically a copy paste thing, so that people see the question right there in the chat, and then I kind of announce it, this is what we're going to do. And then, like, I think a lot of people are doing, or several people are doing this in the Liberating Structures community, where they say don't hit enter until we're all done. Now, one thing that does is it kind of encourages everybody to respond. Okay, you know, I was in a Zoom meeting yesterday where people were orally checking in and or orally responding to a big weighty question. And there's this kind of like, oh, I agree with what everybody said. So that lets people off the hook, you know, if they don't find their words for saying it. And I think that's really important, that people go through the effort to say, this is what I think, without necessarily being influenced by people that they think are more knowledgeable. Okay, so that's kind of a little, you know, we've been talking about the hierarchy kinds of things, and hierarchy and status are important. You know, we need to learn from people who have more experience, but it can also be a problem.
Can I ask you two questions related to that technique?
Yeah.
So one is, how long do you like to wait for people to be able to respond? Because sometimes I've been on those types of techniques, and I feel like there's not enough time. Even when they say just put the first thing in your head, it's still, somebody like me just needs a little more time to think about that. So speaking of hierarchies and trying to make it as accessible for people. So that's one question. And then the other question I had also, because I've seen this, do you demarcate different segments of the conversations in the chat? And if so, how do you do that?
Well, so going back to that example, and this is not a perfect example I'm finding. So I put a quote and then a bunch of equal signs and then the question. Okay. And, you know, then a demarcation below and above to make it really clear, because so, and then one thing to go to your point, the first question is always super simple and, you know, in my mind at least, easy to respond to. So that helps people find the chat. It reminds people that actually there's something interesting in the chat, that scanning it is something they can do on their own in real time. You know, they might see a friend or someone that looks interesting to follow up with, and, you know, just kind of knowing who's there. So first of all, and just making sure that everybody's quote unquote voice is there. But then, and so for that, I say, well, how is everybody ready? And so for that kind of question, everybody being ready happens a little bit, kind of, there's less variance between the early birds and the people that need more time. So I ask people to raise their hands or, you know, indicate somehow. And this is an example of reading the room. Like in this context, I always have it on gallery view so that I can look at everybody's kind of body language and and I don't hit enter myself until I think everybody, and then I say, okay, let's hit enter. The other thing there is that the second question usually requires more thought. And so there's more variance. And the third, more thought again. So with all that yakking, did we discuss both questions?
Yes. So, and to clarify, so do you cut and paste the question along with the dashes? So you don't have to manually dash them. That's
right.
Okay.
Manual dashes are kind of slow, so I kind of queue them up in a text editor beforehand. Now, the reason for the quote is that we're going to use a tool that a fellow on liberating structures pulled together that's really cool. And so it's kind of, the impact of that tool is now kind of changing what I'm thinking about how to do it, because I think you want both a demarcation, and somehow the way I'm doing it makes the question invisible in the final output. So let's just jump ahead to where we're going here. So very briefly, so as not to expose too much personal information from people like who did not give their consent. Here's the question, here's the demarcation, and then here's the responses. Okay, so part of where we're going is that we're not just using the format that Zoom uses. We're going to put it in a HTML table that is much easier to scan and easy to comment on. Like, you know, you can't really add annotations to the Google, to the Zoom chat. But you know, if people are doing substantial thinking, you might want to kind of mark it or say, well, let's follow up, or say, here's an easy response.
So it becomes a working document that
Right.
has a life beyond the session.
Right. And that goes to the issue you were describing of your friend who wants to keep a record. So this actually, of the meeting, this goes beyond, because this is the meeting in some ways. And it also links between the meeting, the questions that were posed, and the engagement afterwards. So, I mean, early in our conversation, you had a rant about calling virtual events. So here's, you know, which is a bad term because it isn't virtual, just to steal your rant, because this is real. You know, people are really relating and talking and thinking. So, you know, I think getting past that idea of the Zoom piece being virtual, separate, and therefore discounted, and saying, well, you know, and here's a record, and here's how we annotated it afterwards, and here's, you know, here's a launch pad for the next step in our relationship or our collaboration or our community.
Mm-hmm. And that also highlights that we're not living, no pun intended, in a binary world. That it's all very fluid. These are how we engage.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because the tools tend to present themselves as separate, and, you know, say, well, Zoom is its world and Google Docs is its world, and, you know, actually it takes some effort and some intention to link between them.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think that's kind of the job of facilitators like you and me, is to demonstrate those links and remind people of, you know, hey, this is the bridge between one and the other, one tool and the other, and you know, you and I are the kind of bridges or binding factors across those. So yeah, we've talked about minimizing what the host sees, preparing the prompts, minimizing the number of tabs. I don't know about you, but I often will have, you know, dozens of tabs, and, you know, and in this kind of setting, you need to have just the right number of tabs. So
Can I also add that there's another prep piece, is making sure that the settings that you want in Zoom or whatever platform you're using are the settings that you want for that particular session, because sometimes we have the meta settings set up and we forget that we might not want to have a particular piece of it available, or that we do and then we find out in the middle of our session, wait, I forgot to set, breakout rooms or something like that. And so, like, I'm just thinking, doing a mental checklist of what goes into the prep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that well, I always underestimate the amount of time that prep takes in terms of planning the agenda, and then the follow-up. Like this morning, um, one of the things that I realized was that I had not really figured out how to pass the baton to some other people that could have made really substantial and appropriate contributions. And, that those handoffs take some forethought and alerting people, like you and I are doing this kind of informal thing because we've talked so long that we know how to interrupt each other. But in a performance, you need to kind of like, you don't want it totally canned, but you don't want it totally out of the blue, like, oh, now you have to make a speech about coronavirus or something, Are you ready? So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about transitions also, in other conversations. Like, I've spent a lot of time being able to see different congregational services by Zoom now, and I've sort of been taking notes on things that worked for me, or were less, felt a little more awkward or whatever. And I realized that a lot of pieces, like if they're those transitional moments, it's not just for services, but as you were saying, for presentations, it's not just the handing off of the technical aspect of the handing off, but how do we make those transitions feel more natural, especially when we're not in a face-to-face setting where there may be other social cues, and maybe we don't have that time to rehearse. And like, are there segues, social segues that can be made in addition to the technical ones?
Yeah, and I think those social segues are different in a business meeting than in a more religious context. I mean, to me, those religious contexts have a lot of wisdom and a lot of history, and they're very embedded in a face-to-face setting. So now we're kind of like figuring out, well, what would that transition from, say, a kind of individual talk or speech to group chanting, okay? So, just kind of making it clear, okay, for the chanting, even though everybody will be saying a chant themselves, we'll only have one person with a mic on, because it just doesn't work if everybody tries to synchronize but can't because of the lags. Some people are, who knows what their internet connection is or where they are. And so, that's a particular segue between different kinds of speech that are going on that maybe are part of a larger whole that's very traditional. But now we're kind of like analyzing and pulling them apart and kind of saying, well, this is how it's going to work on Zoom. And I think that's a really creative process that we need to bring attention to. Like, your practice of going around to different congregations and observing those transitions is huge. So maybe our next call that we record and share with the world It's going to be about that. So let's see. Another piece here is how to take that that chat and turn it into a resource. So I'm going to share again. This is a thing that Louis Sweeney put together in the Liberating Structures community. And it's extremely good for doing something really quickly and effortlessly. And you know, it's grown in value over time. Like now it has, he's cleaning out private messages over here. And he's including private messages over in this column. So what you do is you open your chat, and I've got a chat here on the back burner and left over from this morning, and then you just paste it in, and the formulas that he's got going here that have regular expressions and are kind of complicated produce a table that then you can plunk into a Google Doc. Okay?
So can mere mortals do this?
You bet. When we post the this, we're going to share the link to that. Now, one of the interesting things is that through use, this tool that he concocted improved. Like it came from, I had some kind of clunky way that I did it on my text editor. He created Google Docs version. Then he created one that works pasting straight from a chat window. And, you know, it's gotten quite a bit more sophisticated and quite a bit more useful. So just to kind of go back to that example, then when you paste from a Google spreadsheet into a document, it looks like this. Okay. Now, the issue that I found was that the question doesn't come through. It gets filtered out by his spreadsheet just because of the details of how I'm doing it. And, but I went through and inserted it. I also made this a heading in Google. Okay, so that this document, which was more or less blank at the beginning, has a table of contents that now, first of all, I had all the slides as a Google Doc here, all the things that I was going to pretend that I was going to present. I inserted the Google Doc, I inserted the link to the video recording. Okay. I always keep snapshots, do a snapshot of everybody there, kind of as attendance, but also kind of as a memory jogger. Hey, we were together. This wasn't virtual. We were together. And then to your question there, the Google, because Google table of contents is clickable and will take you to the part of your document in the chat. So you can go down through the places that you have demarcated and say, okay, here is the different sections of the conversation to make it kind of scannable. And, you know, the checkouts this morning were not that interesting. In earlier meetings for this group, they were a big deal, actually. The checkouts were where the real gold was.
Mm.
So actually making that demarcated section in your text, in your chat transcript, a link in a Google Doc, all of a sudden makes it more navigable and accessible for scanning and reference. You know, now in a forum, I can point people exactly to the place where this issue comes up. So, you know, I think that that's an example of the kind of evolving practice of doing a meeting. As the tool makes things easy or possible, it kind of reveals more opportunities for doing what we were talking about, which is this kind of linking the different tools that appear separate into a kind of process and kind of network of resources.
Mm.
Another thing I didn't mention, I just heard a beep, which is mail coming in. During the event this morning, I turned mail off because my mail reader will just update and, you know, make a sound. So, so that's kind of one more thing, just kind of the whole arc here, is that there were a few people that hung out a little bit at the end.
Mm.
And so we got to talking like what worked about this meeting. And there were very interesting comments, which I didn't write down in the chat or in electronic form. I took hand note, you know, I actually wrote them down with a pencil, believe it or not. And then I wrote those up and posted those so that the forum now has the original invitation to the meeting. It has the table of contents to this from this Google Doc, which doesn't look quite as nice. It lost the indentation, but you know, it kind of shows here's all the things. And then I appended, and here's some reflections about how to make this kind of meeting more effective. Because part of the strategy is that, you know, we're trying to spread good practice for Zoom meetings so that you can be more productive, more friendly, to have more of a convivial atmosphere. Like, how can we come together and do things that are different in some regards and the same old human issues in other regards?
Mm.
So that's the debrief. Any other kind of reflections?
Well, I'm wondering, is there anything that you would, for the next time, do slightly differently or have a little more emphasis on?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me pull up the notes that I made this morning. One is more planning. You know, like this was a meeting that was an hour and a half, and it you know, it took me another basically hour and a half to kind of, you know, do the notes and oh, one thing I didn't mention was that while there was a breakout going on,
Mhm.
I put the chat so far in that Google spreadsheet and then copied it into that notes document and showed it to everybody and said, you know, here's an example of real-time use of your chat contributions in this form that we think is kind of more easy to use and scan. Okay. So yeah, you know, more planning in advance for handoffs. Another thing is that, you know, I feel like we kind of actually had an opportunity for people to express their feelings of frustration with the technology and fears. The topic of this was how to do events in your meditation center with Zoom. Okay, so exactly the kind of things that you're observing in congregations, you know, it's kind of how do we take these very traditional forms and reinvent them on Zoom in a way that matters, that, you know, satisfies and supports people. So in this meeting, you know, we tried to say, well, we'll talk about how you're feeling in doing this. And that's modeling the whole idea that, you know, this is not kind of cold virtual thing, but this is real human interaction and you're part of it. And you as a host have kind of an obligation to really help people feel more comfortable and more intimate and more creative. So another thing that the debrief brought out was that this is one of a series. And so we're kind of building on the skills and the expectations and the, you know, the appreciation that people have had based on previous meetings. And, you know, one thing we didn't do was like say, okay, in a month, we're going to have, we talked generally about how people don't know how to set up really effective, low effort ways of making a donation. Okay, so in a face-to-face setting, people can, you know, drop a few bills in a jar or something like that. That's a little harder online. And so we kind of said, okay, we're going to talk about that, but we didn't say, and here's the date, put it on your calendar now. So I think in terms of creating this sense of a trajectory, that would be very useful. So, you know, I think that the other thing that came out in the reflections afterwards is that there's kind of differential benefits for different people. The IT team that I lead was saying, oh, we know a lot more about how to write documentation and support documents by listening to people like we did today. And so, you know, the session today benefits them. We did some training for them, but we also did some training for us. You know, we're kind of fine-tuning our ears as to what are the issues out there and how are things working in centers around the world. One thing that we did was have the breakout session. You know, we kind of had these check-in questions, and then we had kind of slides that said, here's this resource, here's that, here's how to do the other thing, here's the kind of Zoom accounts that you have, and kind of more dry things. But then the breakout topic actually came up this morning on a forum where people where someone was asking, well, how can I make the event have a sense of sacred space? Okay, so first of all, you don't want me to tell you how to do this. This is something that everybody needs to, in some ways, feel in their bones if they're doing it for their community. You know, it's not a bunch of bullet lists. It's kind of those ineffable kind of heart things that will come across And yet there's a lot of techniques. So that's what we talked about in the breakouts. And the breakouts were only 10 minutes, but I think people really appreciated having, first of all, the challenging question that in the end is really what's on people's minds. You know, they don't care about Zoom or technology or chat. They care about offering something that's really valuable to their communities and to people from outside their communities. And so the opportunity to work on that question together in groups, you know, I aim to have groups of 5 or 6. I think some of them ended up as maybe 3 or 4. So there's a sweet spot issue there. You want them to be big enough to have some real diversity, but small enough so that everybody feels like they can contribute and they're called upon to contribute.
How much time do you use in the breakout room, or does it depend on what the purpose is?
Yeah, I think it depends a lot. Like sometimes this morning we had 10 minutes for that. And I didn't join a breakout group. You know, usually I kind of want to be in and part of it and kind of like, oh, let's talk and I can share what I know and blah, 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 you know. But this morning, I kind of did not go into a breakout room, and I did the whole maneuver of getting the chat into that document to show them, because I thought that was more important to demonstrate that piece of it.
So you're also, as an aside, talking about like the facilitator or producer's role also,
Yes.
and when to make those judgments.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's something that I advise people to do, and I didn't do it, is have one person be the technical host and another be the facilitator, you know. And I think that's an example of something that, you know, you may have the idea, but doing it, you've got to have it in your bones before you really do it. So one of the things that came out was that in that in those breakouts, there was a really deep respect for the question of safety and how sacred space needs to be safe space, okay? And that before we had had a discussion about Zoom safety and passwords and claim host before this, and can you log on before the host shows up, and all of these kind of intricate things. And it felt a little bit like, you know, geeking out on the question of safety, but it based in the breakout rooms, it's kind of like, oh, safety is not a side issue. You know, that's what we're offering in some ways, is safety for your own heart and your own mind. And so I think maybe that's a point to kind of start wrapping up. Any thoughts about this, what we're doing here?
This is fun, and it made me think more deeply about what we were talking about, and also just gave me a really lovely insight into how you think about things. And you're one of my go-to people, as you know. So it was just, I enjoyed being, you know, walked through your process.
Mm-hmm.
And having been the recipient of a lot of your the end product, it was nice to hear like everything that, you know, you're breaking it down, and we only really talked about the prep, which, you know, I think seems to be a high percentage of what you were saying, is that it's a high percentage of the facilitation aspect, and you really honed in on what it looks like. So, and you did it from the heart in a safe space.
Yes, yes. And, I think that's one thing that our kind of monthly partnering like this is creating a safe space that, we can talk about how technology impacts our respective communities. And it's so valuable that, our communities are different in some respects, and then they're also so much the same in other respects. Um, I think that going back to the point about what happened afterwards, it was largely putting together the chat transcript, cleaning it up enough, like dealing with the fact that the questions didn't show up in that tool in the right way, and then let's see. Then there was a whole process. Like, one of the things that I'm trying to do is bring together different groups. Like, they're in the forums that we have. There's one forum for quote unquote center leadership, and another forum for technology or technical people. And I'm trying to bring those together. So, because, and I said this explicitly, like, this situation of offering programs and practice events online means that you can't separate them. And so you have people with different perspectives and skills that need to collaborate at a deep level. It's not like, here's what I know, and so you go make it happen. It's kind of like back and forth. Here's what's possible. Here's what we want. Here's what's possible. Here's how the whole thing is evolving. And so part of what took time was figuring out how to post in 3 different forums. Here's a way to enter into the materials that were gathered, and kind of setting up to prompt further discussion and further collaboration. So, that's a kind of follow-on work that, just takes time, is to think, okay, here's the different situation, different settings, here's the message, here's where I want to encourage the conversation to happen in this middle forum that invites people from both sides. Yeah.
And it's like you're fostering a living, breathing conversation. So one of the original ideas, if I understood you correctly, actually came from a forum question.
That's right.
And that fed the presentation. And now that was going to be my last question was how does this live beyond, and to what extent is it a thread for the next work? And that may not be a linear thread.
Yeah, it's definitely a weaving part, because some threads go off in different directions, and then they come back. As Bev Trainer once said, all of our side conversations lead us back to the main point. That's exactly right. So, I think that this is a kind of offshoot, and I'm going to share this video in those forums and just say, well, here's John talking out of school, in effect, okay, but talking about what we're doing, and encouraging the idea that the boundaries between our religious and faith communities and the rest of the world do have a purpose, but they can also be problematic and, create boundaries that don't serve us or the world. Another thing that strikes me is that the process that I went through this morning will probably never be repeated. You know, each time it kind of little bit of evolution to make it, you know, less effort, more, you know, as we discover what are the goals, what are the positive outcomes, you know, finding ways to make those happen more reliably. So, thank you.
Thank you.